The widow lived in a small wooden cabin at the edge of the valley, her days carved out by hard work and quiet endurance. Life had left her with little after her husband's passing, just 2 children, a few chickens, and a patch of land that barely yielded enough to keep them through the seasons. Each morning before the sun rose, she stoked the fire, cooked what little they had, and sent her children into the fields to help gather wood or tend to the few vegetables that dared to grow. She carried her burdens with grace, but deep inside, she feared for the future of her children, knowing the weight of poverty was unkind and relentless. It was during one of those evenings when the sky turned crimson and the winds carried the scent of dust from the plains that she found him. Her youngest son had been out near the old creek gathering water when he spotted a man sprawled in the weeds, half broken and gasping for breath. His clothes bore the marks of wealth, finely tailored but torn and bloodstained, boots scuffed from a long ride, and a watch gleaming faintly in the dying light. The boy had run back shouting, and the widow, without hesitation, hurried to the stranger's side. The man was pale, his skin fever-hot, his body trembling. A deep wound on his side spoke of violence, perhaps a robbery, perhaps a feud gone wrong. She knew nothing of his story, only that his life was hanging in the fragile space between breath and silence. With no one else to turn to, she called her children to help her lift him, their small arms straining against his weight, and together they carried him back to their humble cabin. Through the night she worked, her hands steady though her heart pounded with fear. She cleaned the wound with boiled water, stitched it as best she could with thread she usually saved for mending clothes, and fed him spoonfuls of broth when he stirred. Her children kept watch, one at his side dabbing sweat from his brow, the other fetching more wood to keep the fire alive. Days stretched into weeks, and slowly, the stranger's strength returned. His eyes, when they finally opened with clarity, were the kind that had seen much of the world, piercing, calculating, but softened by gratitude when they fell upon the widow and her children. He said little at first. His voice was gravelly, worn from both injury and silence. He asked her why she had saved him, why she had risked what little she had for a man she did not know. She answered simply, that no life should be left to fade alone in the dirt, no matter who it belonged to. Her children nodded, their innocence unshaken, their belief that kindness was worth more than anything else shining through their wide eyes. As strength returned to his body, fragments of his life began to surface. He was a man of land and wealth, once powerful, but now betrayed by those he trusted. He had been left to die far from his home, his riches meaningless in the face of death. In the quiet of the widow's cabin, he found something he had not known for years, warmth that came not from wealth, but from care freely given. He began to help where he could, mending fences with the boy, teaching the girl how to handle a horse, speaking softly with the widow by the fire when the nights grew long. In time, his wound fully healed, but his heart had changed in ways even he did not expect. The laughter of the children, the resilience of the widow, and the simple dignity of their lives struck something deep in him. He saw how they struggled, how the children wore shoes too small and patched too many times, how the widow's hands were rough from endless work, how their meals were stretched thin. And yet, despite their hardships, they had given everything to save him. The day came when he saddled his horse, strong enough to ride again. The widow stood silently at the door, her children clutching at her skirts, sadness hidden behind their brave faces. They thought he was leaving, and in truth, he was. But weeks later, when a line of wagons rolled down the valley carrying supplies, new tools, livestock, and men ready to build, the widow realized his departure was not abandonment but a promise kept. The rich cowboy returned, not as a broken man but as their benefactor. He gave them more than they could ever dream, a ranch larger than any in the valley, livestock enough to secure their future, and men to work the land. To the widow, he offered not charity, but partnership, a chance to stand with him in life rather than bow beneath its weight. For the children, he gave a future rich not only in security but in hope. The widow never asked why he chose them, why he did not return to the glittering world of wealth he had once known. Perhaps it was because, in their cabin, he had been treated not as a man of riches but as a human soul in need. Perhaps it was because he found in their humble home something no gold could buy: family, trust, and the quiet kind of love that asks for nothing in return. And so, their lives changed forever. The man who had come to them half dead brought with him not just fortune but a bond unshakable, forged in the space between despair and mercy. In saving him, they had unknowingly saved themselves, and the ranch that rose from the valley stood not as a symbol of wealth, but of what kindness can create when given without expectation. The valley was quiet except for the wind whispering across the fields, carrying with it the scent of dust and the faint rustle of brittle grass. At the far end of that valley, in a small wooden cabin weathered by years of storms and sun, lived a widow and her 2 children. Her life had been carved by hardship and endurance since the day her husband was lowered into the ground, leaving her with more burdens than blessings. The widow's name was Clara. Her face bore the marks of years spent working under a merciless sun, her hands rough and calloused from endless labor. She had been a rancher's wife once, and the land had not been kind to her family. What little her husband had left her was already slipping away, piece by piece, as debts mounted and the soil grew tired. Yet she stood unyielding, refusing to break, because 2 pairs of eyes depended on her. Her son, Samuel, just 12, lean but strong for his age, and her daughter, Mary, a tender 8 years old, with a voice like birdsong and a spirit too gentle for the harshness of the plains. Every morning, Clara rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and prepared what meager food they had. Often it was nothing more than cornmeal porridge, thin enough to stretch for 3 bowls. She saved the larger portion for her children, convincing them she had already eaten. Samuel worked beside her, hauling wood, tending the small garden, and trying to catch rabbits in the traps his father had once taught him to set. Mary helped with the chickens, humming softly to them as if her voice could coax them into laying more eggs than their weary bodies could manage. Life was survival, nothing more. Clara often lay awake at night staring into the darkness, wondering how long she could keep the children fed, how long she could keep the wolves, both the ones in the wild and the ones wearing men's faces, at bay. The world beyond her cabin was full of threats, yet she shielded her children with all the strength she had left. It was during one of those late summer evenings, when the air was thick with heat and the sun bled red into the horizon, that everything changed. Samuel had gone to the creek with a bucket, his bare feet kicking up dust as he hurried down the narrow trail. He was halfway back when he spotted something unusual in the weeds along the bank. A man, sprawled face down, his clothes torn, his body unmoving. Samuel's heart leapt into his throat. For a moment, he thought the man was dead, but then he noticed the shallow rise and fall of his chest. "Ma!" Samuel shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "Ma, come quick!" Clara dropped the basket of laundry she was carrying and ran, Mary chasing behind her. When she saw the man lying there, her breath caught. He was tall, broad-shouldered even in weakness, his face pale and streaked with sweat. A dark stain spread across his shirt where blood had seeped through, the wound deep and angry. His boots were of fine leather, though scuffed from hard riding, and a silver watch glimmered faintly at his side. Whoever he was, he did not belong to the world of poverty Clara and her children knew. Without hesitation, Clara knelt beside him, pressing her fingers to his neck. A pulse, weak but steady. She looked at Samuel. "Help me lift him. Mary, run ahead and get the door open." Samuel's thin arms strained as he helped his mother hoist the man upright. He was heavy, his body limp, but together they managed to carry him back up the trail, stumbling into the cabin just as the last light faded from the sky. Clara laid him on the narrow bed that had once belonged to her husband, her hands already moving with practiced urgency. She boiled water, tore strips from one of her few clean sheets, and examined the wound. It looked like a knife had torn into him, the cut jagged and deep. She had no medicine beyond herbs she gathered in the woods, but she did what she could, cleaning the wound, stitching it with a needle and thread meant for mending clothes. The man groaned once, his lips moving as though to speak, but no words came. Through the long hours of the night, Clara worked. Samuel fetched water. Mary sat at the man's side and dabbed his forehead with a damp cloth. The cabin filled with the sounds of fire crackling, water boiling, and the ragged breath of a man clinging to life. Clara's eyes grew heavy, but she refused to rest. Death had already taken one man from her home. She would not allow it to take another, even if he was a stranger. When dawn broke, the man was still alive. His breathing was shallow, but steadier. Clara slumped into a chair, exhaustion washing over her, while her children watched him with wide eyes. Days passed. The man hovered between life and death, drifting in and out of fevered sleep. Clara fed him broth spoon by spoon, forcing it past his lips when he could not swallow on his own. She mixed poultices of herbs and pressed them against his wound, whispering prayers under her breath, though she no longer knew if anyone was listening. Slowly, his strength returned. His eyes opened, gray and sharp even in weakness, scanning the room before settling on Clara. "You saved me," he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. Clara shook her head. "I did what anyone ought to do." "Not anyone," he said, his eyes narrowing as if trying to understand her. "Most would have left me to the coyotes." Samuel, who was standing by the door, spoke up. "Ma says no man should die alone in the dirt." The stranger studied the boy, then shifted his gaze to Mary, who sat clutching her doll made of rags. Something softened in his expression, though it was gone in an instant. Over the following weeks, he grew stronger. Clara learned that his name was Jacob Hartwell. He was not just a cowboy but a man of land and wealth, though he said little of how he had come to be left for dead by the creek. His words were few, but his eyes carried the weight of betrayal and violence. He helped where he could, though still weak, splitting small logs with Samuel, brushing the horses with Mary, and sitting by the fire with Clara in the evenings. Clara noticed the change in her children first. Samuel admired Jacob's strength, listening with rapt attention when Jacob showed him how to hold a rope or repair a saddle. Mary adored him, often curling up beside him with her doll as though he had always been part of their small family. And though Clara tried to guard her heart, she could not deny the way his presence filled the cabin, the way his steady voice and quiet watchfulness eased the loneliness that had weighed on her since her husband's death. Jacob, for his part, seemed equally changed. He had known wealth, power, and the sharp edges of men's greed, but in Clara's cabin, he found something he had long forgotten: kindness freely given, without expectation. He saw the way Clara sacrificed for her children, the way Samuel worked beyond his years, the way Mary laughed despite hunger and hardship. They had nothing, yet they had given everything to save him. One evening, as the firelight danced across the room, Jacob spoke. "You didn't ask who I was. Didn't ask what I'd done or why I was bleeding in the dirt." Clara looked up from her sewing, her needle flashing in the dim light. "Didn't matter. A man's life is a man's life." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded, as though her answer told him more about her than any question could. And though his body healed, Jacob's heart wrestled with a truth he had not yet spoken. He had not been left to die by chance. He had been betrayed, ambushed by men he once trusted, left with nothing but the strength to crawl until the world faded. Yet somehow, fate had led him to this cabin, to this widow and her children, whose mercy had given him life again. And deep within him, a resolve began to grow, a resolve that would one day change their lives forever. The ranch seemed a world apart from the noise of town, but trouble had a way of riding farther than welcome. Word spread that the girl was no longer in chains, no longer bowing her head in silence. It unsettled men who believed her place was at the end of a rope or under a boot. One evening, as the sky burned crimson, 3 riders appeared at the edge of the pasture. Their horses kicked up dust, and their voices carried sharp through the dry air. The rancher stepped out onto the porch, shotgun resting across his arm. The girl stood just inside the doorway, her heart pounding, though she held her chin high. "We heard you bought yourself a prize," one of the men sneered, spitting into the dirt. $3 for a slave. But you're too soft to use her proper. Thought we'd come and take her off your hands. The rancher's eyes narrowed. "You turn your horses around. Ain't nothing here for you." The man laughed, his hand brushing the butt of his pistol. "Everything's for sale if you ain't man enough to keep it." For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them. The cattle stirred in the distance, restless, sensing the tension. Then, with a speed that came not from anger but from the calm of long years, the rancher lifted the shotgun. His voice rang steady. "She's no man's property. Not mine, not yours. You cross this fence, you won't cross back." The riders shifted uneasily. They had expected weakness, an old man softened by loneliness. What they saw instead was steel in his eyes, a will forged in battlefields and hardened by years alone. They muttered curses, turned their horses, and vanished into the rising dark. Inside, the girl's hands trembled, but not from fear. Something else surged in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and fierce pride. She looked at him, and for the first time, she believed his words, that she was free here, and that freedom had teeth enough to defend itself. But the incident left a mark. Rumors thickened, whispers in town growing into open suspicion. Some said he'd broken the law by buying her. Others claimed she'd bewitched him, that she'd taken what wasn't hers. The rancher knew the weight of such talk. In frontier towns, law bent to the loudest voices, and justice came often from the barrel of a gun. One morning, 2 lawmen rode up, dust trailing behind them. They bore papers stamped with ink and authority. Their voices were hard, accusing him of unlawful ownership, accusing her of being contraband, as though she were nothing more than smuggled goods. The rancher stood his ground. "She works this land. She's free here. You've no claim on her." The lawman laughed. "Freedom don't come cheap. You think $3 buys it? She goes with us." The girl's breath caught, terror clawing at her chest. She had thought the chains gone forever, but here they came again, dressed in badges and polished boots. The rancher's jaw clenched, his hand hovering near his holster. A single wrong move and the yard would fill with blood. Then the girl stepped forward. Her voice, soft but steady, cut through the standoff. "No," she said, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "I stay. This is my home. I will not go." The words startled them all. She had spoken not as a possession, not as a rescued victim, but as someone claiming what was hers. The rancher felt his chest swell with a pride so sharp it hurt. The lawman shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of her gaze. They muttered about returning with more men, with warrants, but their threats rang hollow against the iron resolve standing before them. They rode off, spitting dust behind, but the girl did not flinch. From that day, the ranch was no longer just his sanctuary. It was theirs. She worked not as someone keeping a debt, but as an equal, walking the fields with the confidence of one who belonged. Neighbors noticed the change. Some frowned, but others, hardened folk who respected strength when they saw it, nodded in quiet approval. The seasons turned. The ranch flourished. He found himself laughing again, surprised by the sound, and she found her voice growing stronger each day. She told him stories from her childhood in broken English, tales of rivers and mountains oceans away. He shared his scars from the war, not for pity, but so she would know he too had carried chains of a different kind. One evening, as the stars blazed bright and the fire crackled low, he spoke the words he had held back for too long. "This land, I want it to be yours when I'm gone. Not because I saved you, but because you saved me. A man can own land, but without someone to share it, it's just dirt. You've made it home." Her eyes shimmered, and she placed her hand over his. "Not dirt," she said softly. "Not prison. Home." And in that moment, the rancher, once a lonely man who thought his life had ended with the war, and the girl, once sold for $3 like cattle at market, stood together as equals. The ranch was no longer a place of silence. It was a place where two lost souls had built something worth more than gold, a sanctuary of freedom, hard-earned and fiercely kept, beneath the endless western sky.